hit record, and we're going to finish chapter 12. If you want to open up to page 354, you can kind of follow along. We finished last Monday the four rivers of the evolution of the presidential office. We begin today's class with another four, which is nicely organized for you in a table on page 354. 4 systems of how the process of selection of the president, or basically the process of selecting the president, has also gone through 4 stages, but our textbook calls it 4 systems of how we elect a president. So this slide here puts it all in one slide, and it's really too small for you to see. So I do have it as a bigger slide for you to see. There we go. Now, basically, this is where we are today. A president has to meet these requirements as laid out in the Constitution. They must have been born here, they must be at least 35 years old, and they have had to live in the United States for 14 years, at least. Once someone declares to be a candidate for president, they will then campaign, of course, and then in January of the election year, so that would have been this year too, back in January they started having primaries and caucuses. We'll talk about the differences between those two things again here in a little bit. But just to use our state as an example, Oklahoma has a primary election. The first primary election in the election year is New Hampshire. And then the first caucus in the election year is the Iowa caucus. Now, primaries are basically where all citizens vote. They go to the polling places and vote for their candidate. A caucus is simply where the political parties, let's say the Oklahoma Republicans, they will have a meeting, probably in Oklahoma City, and anyone who's a Republican can go there and help choose who they want to be the presidential Republican candidate. That was an example if we had a caucus. So Iowa has a caucus, so all of the Republicans in Iowa would go to some of you who's real good about state capitals. What's the capital of Iowa? Is it Des Moines? Anybody? Bueller?
Des Moines.
Okay, so they would go to the convention at Des Moines and they would all be together to pick who their candidate would be. So that's how a caucus is different than a primary. A primary is where the individuals go to vote. A caucus is where all registered voters can attend a convention and then pick who they want. So once candidates start to win some of the primaries, they start to gain momentum and they continue to campaign, and you'll have other candidates drop out who don't win any of the primaries or caucuses. And eventually, once all the states have their primaries and caucuses, basically you know who the Republican and Democrat candidate is. They will then have a national convention where they will get the official nominee. This year, there were not national conventions because of COVID. They tried to do it virtually, but the Republicans once again chose Trump, and the Democrats chose Biden. At the national conventions, the presidents will choose who their running mate will be to be vice president. After the conventions, the president and vice presidential candidates then campaign again. And remember, we have debates. Then you have the general election, which is the first Tuesday in November, excuse me, which this year it's November 3rd. This coming Tuesday, we're 6 days away from the general election. I don't know if you can read this here, but it'll be on the slide. When people cast their vote, they are actually voting for a group of people known as electors. In January, the Electoral College will meet, and there's 538 electoral delegates, and a candidate has to get 270 of those to become the president. The electoral delegates are supposed to vote the way that the state voted. So you can see here very faintly that Oklahoma has 7 this might be an old one, we should only have 5 electoral candidates. Most likely our state's going to go Republican again. So Trump will get all 5 or 7, if I'm wrong. We'll get all of our electoral votes. There's only 2 states that divide their electoral votes: Nebraska and Maine. And the way they divide it is like, let's say in Nebraska, they get, looks like they get 5 votes. So let's say 60% voted of the people voted for Trump and 40% for Biden. Then Trump will get 3 of the electoral votes and Biden would get 2. Because Nebraska and Maine do not have a winner takes all in the electoral votes. And there's a lot of people who think that that's the way it should be for all states. Let's look at Texas, where there's 38 votes. Let's say it was 50-50 there. Some people think Trump should get 19 and Biden should get 19. Let's say it was 52. Let's say it was 51 to 49%, with Trump getting 51%. He's going to get all 38 votes. Some people would say Trump should get maybe 20, and then Biden should get 18. Anyway, there's a lot of debate about the Electoral College. So let's move on. You can look over that. This slide gives you a very, this basically makes this a lot simpler. In January, the nomination process begins with individual states having their primaries and caucuses. New Hampshire is the first primary, and again, Iowa is the first caucus. Then, once all the states have had their primaries and caucuses, remember, I think Oklahoma's in April. Once we've had all of those, we know who our candidate is going to be for each party. Then there's national conventions in the summertime. They choose a vice president. They start campaigning again. They have debates. Then the election in November of the citizenry, the population, the populace. This would be the popular vote. And then you have the Electoral College in January. Usually, the candidate who wins the popular vote also, the candidate who becomes president usually wins the popular vote. There have been 4 elections where the new president did not win the popular vote. Trump, Bush in 2000, the third one was also in the 20th century, or I should say within the last 60 or 70 years. And before those 3, there had only been one way back in the 1800s. So that's why there's a lot of talk of getting rid of or revamping the Electoral College. I'm going to talk very quickly about the Electoral College after we look at those 4, if you want to look with me, we'll just look at the chart on page 354. These 4 systems of how the president is elected. And basically, these are the 4 systems that have come about since the founding of our country. Basically, we could call it the evolution of the process of selecting the president. So you can see the original provisions were that, strictly according to the Constitution, the president and the VP were chosen by a special body of presidential electors. These electors were not chosen by the citizens in their states. So, for example, we had 13 states when the Constitution was written. Every state was awarded the same number of electors. The way that you can look there in your book, the Electoral College members are chosen the party nominees are chosen in congressional caucuses. So George Washington was chosen by a congressional caucus. I'm not sure anybody really ran against him. I think someone did run against him in that first election, but he won by a landslide. In the second election, he won again, and he ran. Whoever ran against him became the vice president. Originally, whichever presidential candidate got the second amount of votes became the vice president. But the only people voting on the nominees were the electors. And you can see that these electors each cast 2 electoral votes. So they voted for 2 people. And the person with the most votes became president, and the person with the second most, again, became vice president. Okay, this is what I was looking for earlier. Each state would have as many presidential electors as it has senators and representatives in Congress. So originally there were 13 states. They each had 2 senators, remember, according to the new Constitution. And then each state had a different amount of representatives. So I'm not sure what that was in the first 13 states. But let's say, for example, Rhode Island was the smallest state. Let's say they had their 2 senators, and let's say they had 3 representatives for a total of 5 people in Congress. So they would have then had 5 electors. And they were chosen, let's stick with the Rhode Island group. Those 5 electors from Rhode Island for the 1788 election would have been chosen in Rhode Island. However, the state legislature directed. So let me try to clear that up and get rid of confusion. Rhode Island gets 5 electors to vote for the president and vice president in 1788. The 5 electors are not the same 5 who are their senators and representatives to Congress, but rather the state Congress. Okay, let's make sure we understand that. The Rhode Island Congress, not the US Congress. The Rhode Island Congress will then choose how they want to elect their 5 presidential electors. Now, it's possible that they could simply say, we want our senators and representatives in the US Congress to also be our electors. But they didn't have to do that. Let's use another state as an example. Let's say Virginia, a state with a big population. Let's say that they had 10 representatives and 2 senators for a total of 12 electoral votes. The Virginia Congress would meet and decide how to choose those 12 electors. Then, okay, so each state has chosen their electors. These electors meeting in their own states would then cast 2 votes. So let's stick with Rhode Island. There's 5 of them. They would each get 2 votes, so that would be 10 votes. And they have to vote for 2 different people. So let's just say in that first election, George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were 3 choices that you could have chosen. Each elector would have chosen 2 different people for president. These votes would be sealed and sent to Congress, where then they would be opened along with all the other states' votes. The person who received the largest number of electoral votes So in the first election, George Washington became president. The total did have to be a majority. And then the person with the second most amount, which was John Adams, became vice president. If there was a tie, or if no one received a majority of the votes, the House of Representatives would then choose the president. But the way they would do it was they would vote by states. So the House of Representatives would meet. Now this is the federal House, and they would say, okay, all of you state members of Congress get together with each other, decide who you will vote for. So again, we're going to stick with Rhode Island. The 5 people from Rhode Island would then meet, and they would decide, okay, who are we going to choose to break this tie? Now, if there was also a tie for the second spot, the vice president, they would be chosen by the Senate. So the House would pick the president if there was a tie, and the Senate would pick the vice president if there was a tie. This is the original way that the president was chosen. So only a few people out of all of the United States citizens picked the president. Only the presidential electors. Now today there's 538 electors because we have 535 senators and representatives. The reason there's 538 electors, which is 3 more, is because the District of Columbia gets 3. But back in the original provisions, there probably wasn't even 100 electors. Maybe. So out of all the people who were US citizens in 1788, that small group picked the president. And this continued to happen until, as you can see in your book on 354, after Jackson's first presidency, Jackson wanted to tie the presidency into the people more strongly, and so he got the inclusion of state parties or state party conventions. And the party conventions of each state would choose the nominees for president. I'm sorry, first, the parties would choose their delegates. Now, here's the good news about this section on 354 and 355. Because it's a little confusing, it's not going to be on the test. So I'm just going to kind of go through it quickly. But in the original provision, your electors had all the power. They basically voted. As they saw fit. It was that mindset that we talked about before, where the well-bred, well-to-do, elite citizens of society are the ones who run the society. Jackson made it to where the common people had more influence in the presidential election. What Jackson did was he persuaded the states to tie in their electoral votes to the popular vote outcome in the state. So let's stick with Rhode Island in the 1832 election. Let's say Rhode Island had a popular vote and the people chose Jackson. Jackson would then, he would receive all the delegates from Rhode Island. This is how it is today. So you have the addition of party conventions, and the delegates who represent a state must vote for who won the popular vote. But then there was a third stage at the beginning of the 20th century. What happened was party bosses tended to control the power to nominate state convention delegates. This is the second paragraph on page 355. The progressives, which would include Roosevelt, Teddy, wanted to kind of dilute the power of the party bosses. What had happened was state party leaders had taken control of the nominating process by handpicking their state delegates. In other words, the delegates who would go to the national convention were chosen by the party bosses. So this is where presidential primaries were added. A presidential primary is the vote of the people in the state to choose their party's presidential nomination, but also choose some or all of the state's party organization's delegates to the national convention. So what was happening up here was the people were voting for the presidential nomination, but the parties within each state were picking the delegates. And then you had a few strong leaders who would dominate in the states, and they would basically choose the delegates who they wanted. What this third system did was tie in the selection of not only the presidential nominee, but the delegates to the national convention to the primary vote. Many states, this is on the state level for the selection of the delegates, the electoral delegates. Many states do use a proportional representation. So for example, if in Oklahoma, 80% of our people voted for Republican delegates and 20% voted for Democratic delegates, then 4 of those delegates will be Republicans and 1 will be a Democrat. And they go to the national convention where all 5 of them must vote for who the voters of Oklahoma choose to be president. When you get to the national convention, Oklahoma does not have a proportional representation, but the winner take all system. And then the fourth and final system came about 50 years ago, where the open caucus process was added. Some states have caucuses, some states have primaries. Again, primaries are where the people, all of the citizens vote. Caucuses are basically conventions. For example, the Democrats of Oklahoma have a convention, and any registered Democrat in Oklahoma can attend and be a part of choosing delegates. Or they might have a local caucus or a district caucus or district convention, and they choose delegates to the state convention. So again, I know those things are kind of, well, not kind of, they are a little bit confusing. You won't have to know these things on the test, these 4 systems. But hopefully you can see that it started out being dominated by a few elite men, white European men who were well-to-do. They were of what was considered to be well-breeding. Their families were in the upper class or royalty. And then through these 4 systems that formed over the years to the system we have today, power is much more in the hands of the people. Now again, some people think that we should get rid of the Electoral College. Some people think we should just reform it. Now I'm going to let you read these slides for yourself along with the textbook material. But basically, the Electoral College is to protect smaller states and the rural areas of our country from being basically overrun by the larger states in the urban areas. Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but he almost had the same amount of votes as Hillary. But if you look at an electoral map from the 2016 election, Hillary is blue. They use the color blue to represent Democrats. Hillary has all of the East Coast and all of the West Coast. And you see this big blue spot around the Chicago area. And you see a big blue spot in parts of Florida and Texas. And then pretty much everything in between, except for a few blue spots, is red, which represents Republican. So what that means is those big blue spots on both ends of the country and in some of the big urban areas had more people than all of the area in the intercontinental United States. But what the Electoral College did was it said these areas that are a lot less states than all the red states, they're not going to continually dominate the red states in the rural areas. So that's what many people believe is the genius of the Electoral College. Very quickly, I'm going to let you read about the nominating campaign, primaries and caucuses. because we're going to have to try to finish chapter 13 all on Friday because the test is coming up Sunday through Tuesday, I believe. So on the very last section of chapter 12, starting on page, what I can do is I can pull another old lecture from last year's class, and if you want to watch that, you can, but you should be able to read it just fine, and remember that the test is open book. But the Office of Presidency, the executive branch, how is it staffed? And who makes up the staff of the executive office? Well, of course, the vice president. And there's some interesting information about the vice president on page 363. For many years, the vice president did not have an office in the White House, but that changed with Jimmy Carter, and he started delegating some of the important policy duties to his vice president. You'll see at the top of page 364, there's the Executive Office of the President, the EOP. This is an important organization that provides the president with a staff that coordinates all the activities of the executive branch. The executive branch and its responsibilities has grown quite a bit since the original Constitution, and one man cannot do all of the work. And so the Executive Office of the President was created in 1939. I think that was up here, yeah. Vice President, you have a cabinet, Executive Office of the President. The EOP contains these three very important bodies. You can see also on the middle of page 364, the WHO, or the White House office, is probably the most important office that serves the president directly. You can see it's his right arm. It includes the Communications Office, the Office of the Press Secretary, and the Office of Legislative Affairs. This consists of the president's personal assistants, which include his top political advisors and his press agents. These people are highly skilled when it comes to political strategy and when it comes to communicating to the public and through the media. These are some of the most powerful individuals in the White House, in Washington. Then you have a cabinet made up of all these leaders of these federal agencies: Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of the Interior. There are 15 executive departments, 8 here and then 7 here, not including the vice president. Now this is an old slide, so some of these have probably changed. I need to update it, but these are the these people with faces. I think Betsy DeVos is still the Secretary of Education, but I know some of these others have changed. Here's some of the close people who would be on the White House office in And I want to show you all these things compared to Washington's, his cabinet during the first presidency. Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and Edmund Randolph. Just 4 cabinet members compared to many, many, many today. There are other agencies that are a part of the executive branch. Commissions, corporations, and again, agencies. That's probably an old one. Get rid of that dude. And so as the chapter ended, there is a struggle or a problem of control. While the president is the big chief, so to speak, he has to contend with powerful individuals in his cabinet, in the executive branch, in various agencies or offices. And so it's much more complex than it was when it was just Washington and his 4 cabinet members. So we kind of finished up that with a speed round. Any questions? So these slides and the video will be up this afternoon. I apologize for not getting it up Monday from Monday's. They are up now, but Monday's lecture and slides, we lost electricity for 24 hours. So, but any questions about anything? All right, may your remaining part of Wednesday and Thursday be good, be excellent, be outstanding, and look forward to seeing you on Friday.
Hey, Mr. Bean.